Debouncing and throttling are two ways to optimize event handling in JavaScript. And these are also the most confusing and widely asked questions when it comes to JavaScript interviews. So in this video, we're gonna discuss debouncing and throttling from absolute scratch and discuss questions that are formed around it in front-end interviews, and also go on to create the polyfill for both of them. So let's discuss a real-world example on where debouncing is used. So over here, I've opened an Indian e-commerce website called Flipkart. And over here, you can see this has a search box. Now, when I go to this search box and I type, let's say, JavaScript books. Did you notice something? When I typed JavaScript and I paused for a few milliseconds, only then this search results updated. So let me show you once again. So let's say if I say hats. So when I'm continuously typing on the keyboard, it doesn't show me any search results. But as soon as I stop for a few milliseconds, which I guess in this case is 300 or 400 milliseconds, it then makes an API call and fetches all of the search suggestions. So this is what exactly debouncing is. It helps us optimize how we call certain events. So over here, if we were to, let's say, make API call on every single keystroke or every single letter that we type in the search box, it will make a lot of unnecessary API calls to the backend, which will put a lot of pressure on our server. So to avoid all of these issues, we use debouncing. So let me explain this visually what was happening in that search box. So let's say we have a search box which has a debounce method and a delay of 400 milliseconds. And we are typing one word after the other. So we are typing all of these words one after the other. And these has, let's say, a gap of 100 milliseconds between them. So while we are typing this, no API call will be executed. But as soon as we paused and made another keystroke after some times, let's say it is more than 400 milliseconds. Let's say it is around 600 milliseconds. So this is the moment where our action will be performed, which in this case is an API call. So this is what debouncing is. It limits the execution of a function call and waits for a certain amount of time before running it again, which in this case is 400 milliseconds. Alright, now let's see where throttling is used in real world. So I've opened twitter.com over here, and you're gonna notice as soon as I scroll this scroll bar to a certain limit, it's gonna make an API call and fetch more posts. So let me show you. If I scroll this, and you're gonna notice as soon as it reaches a certain point, it makes an API call and fetches more posts. So what's happening over here? So we have added throttling to this scroll action in our web page. And when it checks that, let's say this is around 500 pixels from reaching the very bottom of the post, then it's gonna call next few posts so that user can get an infinite scrolling effect. I know it might be hard to understand in first go, but let me show you how it works. So let's say we are constantly scrolling our web page. And let's say we have this web page over here, and now we are scrolling our window, and as soon as the event checks that okay, now this is around 500 pixels from reaching the very bottom of our screen, so then it makes an API call and fetches more number of posts so that the user is constantly being fed with more and more number of posts, and he gets the infinite scroll effect. And in throttling as well, when we monitor this event, we are not supposed to monitor in every single scroll, right? Because if we are gonna monitor it in every single scroll, then it's gonna be literally thousands of API call at once. So that's why throttling works like this. So let me remove this. And now, so these are, let's say, the events of our scrolling, right? So we are scrolling our web page. So we are not supposed to call API call on every single scroll of our web page, right? Because again, as I mentioned there, because that is going to be thousands of call. So what we do is we assign it a certain amount of time. Let's say in this case, we say 500 milliseconds. So now what's gonna happen is it's gonna only make the API call every 500 millisecond. Just like that. And even if we, let's say, make only one API call, and let's say don't make an API call for next, let's say, 1 second, and then again we make an API call, then also this will be triggered because this 500 millisecond threshold has been passed. So the only time that this will not invoke that event is when we are under this 500 millisecond mark over here. Right? So this is exactly how throttling works. Throttling is a technique to limit the execution of an event handler function. even when this event triggers continuously due to user actions. So user action over here is a scrolling. So this can be anything, scrolling, resizing our window, or many other things. Alright, now let's move on to the most asked JavaScript interview questions on debouncing and throttling. So I've opened VS Code over here with simple HTML, CSS and JavaScript files. So let me run this. So here we go. And our first question is this over here. So we're supposed to create a button UI and add debounce as follows. So every time the button is pressed, we are supposed to show this message, button pressed X times. And we have to show another message called trigger Y times. And when the count of this Y will be increased, it will be increased every time we stop pressing the button and 800 milliseconds have been passed. So you might remember that search example from that e-commerce website. Every time we were typing inside of the search, if it was less than a particular time, it won't call the API. But let's say if the gap between keystrokes was more than 400 milliseconds, only then it will make the API call. So in our case, this is 800 milliseconds. So let me show you how we're going to create the UI for this. So below this div, I'm going to create a button with class increment btn. And below this, I'm going to have two paragraphs which will say button pressed 0 times and triggered 0 times. And all of these things have a class. So button has a class increment btn, and this 0 has a class of increment pressed, and this 0 has a class of increment count. Okay, fine. Let's see the UI. Yep. All right. So this button obviously will not work right now because we haven't added the functionality. So let's see. Let's go to our script.js, and I'm going to target each of these DOM elements. Document dot query selector, and I'm going to target this button over here. Cool. And similarly, I'm going to target this increment pressed and this increment count, just like that. Cool. Now we're going to have two variables to display these counts, right? So for each of these counts, I'm going to have one variable. So one is going to be the pressed count, another is going to be the triggered count. Awesome. Now we're supposed to add the event listener in our button, right? Which is going to listen to every click event. So I'm going to say button.add event listener, and we're going to add a click event. And every time we click the button, it's going to fire off this function over here. So what's going to happen is we're going to increment this pressed count and add it to the inner HTML of this increment pressed class. That is this over here, right? Because we're supposed to increment it every time we press the button. So, okay, we're going to say pressed. Oh, not this. We're going to say btn press dot inner HTML is ++ pressed count. Okay, let's see. So now every time we press increment, yep, that's working fine. Cool. And now we're supposed to do the same thing with this count as well. So I'm going to say count dot inner HTML ++ trigger count. But there's a problem over here. This will also increment this trigger count every time, right? So that is not what we want. We want that every time we are pressing this button, and when we stop pressing this button, only after 800 milliseconds or more, this will be incremented. Not every time we press the button, right? So what are we going to do? Obviously, we're going to use debouncing. So either we can create our own implementation of debounce, or we can use the debounce function from a library like Lodash. So currently I'm going to use Lodash. Also, you have to ask your interviewer if you're allowed to use Lodash or create a custom implementation. If you're supposed to create a custom implementation, then stick around. I'm going to create it very soon in this video. So we have this Lodash library over here. And in the documentation, we can see we have this debounce function, which takes a function and a wait time. Okay, fine. But first, let me install this Lodash. So I'm going to say Lodash CDN. And take the CDN from right over here and simply add it to our HTML right over here. Now let's go back to our script.js, and I'm going to create a new function, debounce count. And inside this, I'm going to have that debounce function that we're going to take from Lodash. And it's going to take a function and a wait time, which in our case is 800 milliseconds, right? Oops, this is debounce. Yeah. And now inside of it, we are going to do this count.innerHTML to ++ trigger count. And we're going to call this function over here. And I guess this should work. This should be good enough. We're pressing these buttons, and as soon as we stop, Yep, 800 millisecond passed, and this increased the count of this triggered times. So again, when we are making a gap of 800 milliseconds or more, only then this is being increased. Only then the count of this is being increased. So this is what the expected answer for this question is. Alright, so for our next question, we again have to create a button UI and add throttle this time. So what's gonna happen is we're gonna again show button pressed X times every time the button is pressed. But this time we are supposed to increase the triggered times count every 800 milliseconds of throttle. So if you remember throttling, what happens in throttling is it limits the execution of an event handler function when the event is triggered continuously due to user actions, right? So I haven't removed our previous code, right? Because it stays the same. All of these buttons and the messages, all of these things stays the same. The only difference is when we increase this should only be increased every 800 milliseconds. So let's see in the Lotus documentation, we have a throttle function, I'm sure. Yep, here we go. Throttle. So this creates a throttle function that only invokes function at most once per every wait milliseconds, right? So this is going to be the wait milliseconds. So this is going to be exactly the same as our previous debounce question. So I'm going to say const throttled count and underscore dot throttle, and again this takes a function and a wait time, which is 800 milliseconds in our case. Now I'm going to take this and add this inside of over here and call this function. Alright, let's see if this works or not. So I'm going to press increment, and you can see this is being triggered every 800 milliseconds. So let me show you properly. So let's say we have a start time over here, which gets the current time at the start, and every time we trigger this, I'm going to have the current time in form of this now. And I'm going to console log now minus start, right? So that it tells us what the current time is with respect to the original time, right? So let's go when we press on increment, you're going to notice that this is being incremented every 800 milliseconds. So you see, if you add this, if you subtract both of these values, all of these values, you're going to notice that this is only being triggered after 800 or more milliseconds. So this is what throttling is.
Pause. If you're not yet following me on Twitter, go to twitter.com/piyush_eon or click the link in the description down below and hit that follow button right now. I'm waiting for you. I'm still waiting. Okay, fine. Let's continue with the video.
Alright, so our third question is to create a debounce polyfill implementation. Yes, the time is here. We are going to create our own implementation for debounce function. But before moving forward, if you're preparing for your front-end interviews and you want me to help you in your front-end interview preparation, just click the link in the description down below and book a call with me. I'll provide you tips, tricks, and a lot of resources which will help you prepare in your JavaScript interviews. So I'm gonna bring our code from the question 1 back so that we can test out our debounce method. So all of the buttons over here and this code over here. So actually now we don't need Lodash anymore, so I'm gonna get rid of that, and instead of that we are going to create our own debounce method. So instead of this I'm gonna say my debounce, and now we're gonna create our debounce polyfill or my debounce method right over here. Cool. So first thing first, we can see that this takes an function or a callback and the wait time. Right, so I'm gonna take a callback over here and the delay or wait time, right? So I'm gonna just say D for the delay time. Cool. Now, since we are supposed to measure the time after every single keystroke or every single button press, we are going to need a timer. So I'm gonna have a variable for a timer. And obviously, since this is going to return a function, which is going to be in this case debounce count, so we are supposed to return a function from it. So return function. And it's going to be an anonymous function. Now, this function is going to take the extra arguments that we are going to provide to this. So for example, so over here we are not providing any extra argument, but if we were supposed to provide any argument, let's say count. So we are going to take count over here. So these are the extra arguments, right? So we are supposed to get them right over here. So I'm going to say args. So I'm going to spread all of these arguments right over here. Cool. Now inside of this, I'm going to assign this timer a set timeout. So timer equals set timeout, and this timeout will have the delay of this D param that we are receiving over here. And inside this set timeout, we are going to call our callback after this amount of time, right? So I'm going to say callback, and I'm going to provide all of the args that we are receiving over here. So let's see if this works or not, or if this has any flaws in the implementation. So I'm gonna go back to our browser and I'm gonna press, there's something wrong over here. Did you notice? Whenever I'm pressing this increment, let's see if I press this 3 times, this is also going to increase 3 times, but after this amount of delay, that is in this case is 800 milliseconds. Let's see if I press this. Even if I press this faster, it's going to be implementing this trigger times as well. So why is this happening? It's because we are not clearing the timeout when the time is less than 800 milliseconds. When the gap between two button presses is less than 800 milliseconds, then we are not supposed to trigger this callback function right over here. So what's the solution for it? So over here, we're gonna check if the timer is already there. So we're gonna clear the timeout. So clear timeout. And we're going to provide this timer over here. And now you're going to see if I press it and now stop, only then the count for this will be increased. So why are we doing this? Because every time we run this myDebounce function, we have to clear this timer, else we're going to have all the timer run one after the other and it's going to fail the purpose of our debounce function. So this is how you implement debounce, and this question is asked a lot in junior as well as in senior developer interviews. The interviewer can give you to implement this debounce function as a standalone question in itself. Alright, now the next question is to create the throttle polyfill implementation, right? So for this as well, I'm gonna bring in our old code, which is this over here, and again I'm not gonna use this dot throttle, I'm gonna say my throttle, and I'm going to create the implementation for this my throttle. So const my throttle, and now again this my throttle takes two things. First is this callback and other is the delay. So I'm going to say callback and delay. Great. Now since throttle perform a little differently than debounce, so let's break it down one by one. So in throttle we have multiple events executing one after the other, right? And we are only supposed to execute the event after a certain delay when all of the events are executing one by one, right? So when a particular event is executed, we are going to record that particular time. So I'm gonna say let last equals 0. By default we're gonna keep it 0. So when the another event happens, we're gonna measure if this particular current time minus our previous time is more than our delay time or not. If it's less than our delay time, then we are going to simply return it and we are not going to do anything. We are not going to execute that event. But if it's more than our delay time, then obviously we are going to execute that particular event. So let me show you in our implementation. So obviously this is going to return a function again. As we can see over here, we have called it as a function. I'm going to say return function. Let me just use an arrow function over here. You can use any function, doesn't really matter. And I'm going to take the extra arguments. And now inside of it, I'm going to take the current time. So let now equals new date dot get time. So we have the current time over here. Now I'm going to check if the current time minus the starting time or the last time is less than d, so it's going to return. But if that's not the case, then last time will be equal to current time. So I'll explain why I've done this over here. Give me a second. So then after that we're gonna say return callback with the args. So now if we see over here, we have last initially as 0, right? Now let's say the second event happens at 200 milliseconds, right? So 200 milliseconds minus 0 is less than d, obviously, right? Because d is 1000 milliseconds. So it's gonna return it. Now it's gonna come back again. Now next event happens at 700 milliseconds. So 700 milliseconds minus 0 is still less than d, 1000, okay? Now again a third event happens and that event happens at 1100 milliseconds. So now 1100 minus 0 is not less than d. So this is not going to return, and now last will be 1100 milliseconds. 1100 milliseconds, and we're going to execute this callback again. Now the next event happens at, let's say, 1500 milliseconds. So 1500 minus 1100, that is our previous value of last, right? So which is 400 milliseconds, and that is still less than d. So this is again going to return. Now again next event happens at 2500 milliseconds, and 2500 minus 1100 is 1400 milliseconds, which is not less than d and it is more than d. So again we are going to assign last the value of 2500. So this is the cycle that will keep on repeating itself as we execute more and more and more and more events. So I'm going to remove this and let's see if this works or not. Yep, you can see every 1 second we are triggering this. Awesome. Yep, so this is exactly what we expected, and this is how you implement throttling in JavaScript. So yeah, these were basically the most asked questions on debounce and throttling. And remember, you're not supposed to use Lodash in your interviews. Just try to create the custom implementation of your debounce and throttle, just like I did. I just used Lodash so that you can use that library while you're creating an app of your own when you don't want to write a custom implementation of debounce and throttle. But in the interviews, you're always required to write all of the videos that I'm going to upload next. Throttle functions. So thank you all for watching this video. If you like this video, give this video a huge fat thumbs up and subscribe to the channel for more such awesome tutorials. And also follow me on Instagram at roadsidecoder to stay updated with